This empire controlled 13% of the world at one point in time. That's around 7.5 million square miles. Today, I'm talking about the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire is also sometimes referred to as the Hispanic monarchy or the Catholic monarchy, and they conquered all of this land. And they weren't just keen on expanding to the New World in the West. They also had their eyes on holdings in places like Italy, the Netherlands, and across Asia. The Spanish Empire started off as a pretty minor player in Europe. However, they eventually rose to be one of the first global superpowers. The lasting impact that this would have on history cannot be overstated. However, they also made a huge mistake, which I'll talk about more at the end of the video, so make sure to stick around. So join me as I take a deep dive into history and try to understand the rise and fall of the mighty Spanish Empire and how it really impacted human civilization. But first, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because I tell stories here where the world of history and finance overlap. And I make these videos every single week, so make sure to check out my catalog. Alright, let's get back to the Spanish Empire, and let's understand how it all started. You see, there were two strategically important regions in what is now around the region of Spain. One was the crown of Castile, and the other was the crown of Aragon. And many scholars actually say that the foundation of the Spanish monarchy started when the heirs to the thrones of Castile and Aragon married. And this event joined the economic and military power of Iberia under one dynasty, and thus began the Spanish Empire. They rose to prominence soon after they conquered the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, which was Granada. Now, history could have played out very differently. You see, Spain inherited Aragon's vast holdings in the Mediterranean. So instead of looking west, Spain could have just gone east to take control of the Mediterranean spice trade. However, one event stopped any kind of ambition like this, and that was the Turkish conquest of Constantinople, which effectively gave them a monopoly over all the spice trade coming in from the east. So instead, the crown of Spain, alongside with Portugal, looked to find an alternate route to what used to be referred to as the Oriental spice markets. Fortunately for Spain, the stars would align perfectly. An Italian explorer by the name of Christopher Columbus stepped forward to take a voyage to find these trade routes. However, his level of confidence was equaled by his lack of geographic literacy. Eventually, the crown would agree to fund his outrageous expeditions, and they did this expecting him to not return. However, in 1492, his voyage would lead him to set foot in the New World and then back again to Europe with his new discovery. So then, Europe was made aware of this entire new continent to their west, one ripe for conquest. This discovery would also pave the way for a treaty that would eventually influence European relations for centuries to come. And this was the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty was significant for two reasons. It was the first attempt at dividing the world on legal grounds, rather than based on, say, of whoever had the most ships or soldiers. The second was that it was the first international law that allowed for Western colonial empires to have extraterritorial jurisdiction over people and places. These kinds of treaties would give European monarchies the legal basis to conquer and colonize lands outside of Europe and enforce their economic policies. And this treaty gave Spain exclusive rights to colonize land from the west of Brazil all the way to the easternmost parts of Asia. The Spanish had great military tactics as well. They inherited some of the best militaries in Europe. So against them, the native population that were there in the Americas stood very little chance. They were ravaged by introduced diseases, and the natives stood very little chance, and this aided the Spanish conquest to go even further uninhibited. Now, the Spanish Empire also brought back a lot from these conquests. For example, they were introduced to the New World crops. The most important of these were maize and potatoes, which they then brought back to Europe. This enabled their population to surge, allowing for even more rapid colonization. Now, the Spanish Empire was expanding with ferocity. For instance, very briefly, the Spanish crown also had rulership over England and Ireland from 1554 to 1558. Spain would also receive the Portuguese crown, gaining control of the kingdom and its vast overseas territories. Effectively, within a lifetime, 6 empires coalesced into one. But the vastness of the empire made it into an administrative nightmare. What happened is that the central authority was weak, and local rulers started exploiting their subjects with no consequences. And this was even more pronounced in the New World territories. The conquistadors who were given lordship over the land that they conquered were supposed to treat their new subjects fairly as per the king's law, but instead they sent them to the mines and plantations and worked them to death. So even though they didn't follow the king's law, this kind of exploitation actually provided the Spanish Empire with immense wealth. For instance, in the 16th century alone, Spain received $3.63 trillion in today's value in gold and silver from New Spain alone. And this didn't even include its other territories. And this type of wealth, in turn, actually helped the Spanish Empire to fund wars to defend its expanding empire and its Catholic faith against its many enemies. However, this very wealth would ultimately turn out to be their curse. You see, most of their wealth was built on the extraction of raw resources. That's why they had no other incentive to invest in other ventures. Essentially, they didn't diversify their portfolio at all. In contrast, many other Western countries began investing in more trade and manufacturing. They didn't just rely on one source, but Spain became more and more reliant on sources like gold and silver coming in from the New World. Some historians say that agriculture was also neglected with the Spanish elites, and they instead opted to import extra food from abroad instead of producing it themselves. After all, they literally had more silver than they could manage. Also, the Spanish kings would end up spending excessively on wars. They had inefficient governance and policies, all of which started to drain their wealth and power slowly. All in all, even though Spain on the surface would remain a very dominant force, from the inside it was growing weak. Ironically, the gold and silver that they were exporting to other Western countries ended up boosting those economies and industries instead. In the end, for the Spanish Empire, as their wealth inevitably exhausted, so did their strength and power. At the end of the day, the mighty empire was bankrupt. Meanwhile, its European rivals were now on the verge of industrialization, and they would set on their own course of empire building. The Spanish Empire left an oversized mark on modern European industry, and by extension, the whole world. It was the first global superpower, and it set the precedent for other European states to follow. Without the Spanish Empire, Europe would have looked very different today. But the lesson I want to draw from here is actually about management of finances. You see, the Spanish Empire had immense potential to remain a superpower for centuries, but they didn't think ahead, they didn't diversify, they didn't think through the governance and policies carefully enough for the long term. Now, if we look at this through a purely financial lens, it actually enables us to appreciate how and why it's important to think ahead. Just because times are great at one point doesn't mean it's going to stay like this forever. Something that the rulers of the Spanish Empire should have probably kept in mind. With all this talk about the fall of great empires, I'm sure you'll be curious about the fall of the Roman Empire. I actually made a video about that here, so make sure to check it out. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you soon.